All right, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Paul Bertler. I'm going to be your host for the workshop, Growing Nuts, Soil Building, and Land Management. I want to take a few moments for some updates before I do an introduction of our presenters. Right about now, at our winter conference, if we were in Worcester, we'd be coming out of whatever that building is, having our delicious made from scratch farmer lunch. That's always so delicious and a great time to meet the other conference goers and do some networking and catching up with old friends. And we'd be wandering around the campus wondering which building we should be heading to next. So, you know, we're not doing that this year. We're in our in our homes and spending time together virtually. So we appreciate you coming out and supporting us and joining us. In this present moment we are living in, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that we are on land that was managed and inhabited before European colonization. Please take a moment to find your location on this map and honor those whose land we now occupy. I also want to mention that NOFA is working to live out the values of our racial equity statement. In the interest of healing the harm that racism and discrimination have caused in the food system, we ask all of us to act in being allies to BIPOC communities by standing against white supremacist behavior and action, by standing together in what is right. The Commonwealth can truly feed and service commonality of us all. I can't think of a better example of white privilege than what we saw in the Capitol this past week. It's important to call it out when we see it, and I don't know what else to say. I'm going to move on. Obviously, we couldn't be here without the help of our sponsors. If we were at the conference in person, we'd be wandering around the vendor place right now as well. We always have great vendors for one of the highlights. Yeah. And I'm happy to say that we also have virtual vendors this year. Many of our vendors have joined us virtually, and they're also doing some vendor sessions in between the workshops. So feel free to check out and support our favorite vendors. So now I would like to introduce our guests, Seva and Kalyan Water from Cummington, Massachusetts. They have an agroforestry farm, very appropriate agroforestry for our New England area. So I'm excited to hear more about what they're up to and to learn from them more about growing nuts.
Good afternoon, everybody. So nice to have so many people joining us. We didn't know how many people to expect, so this is a great turnout.
Yeah. Welcome, everyone.
Welcome. My name is Seva Water.
And I'm Kalyan.
Kalyan, sorry.
And we are the co-owners, farmers at Nutwood Farm here in Cummington. And we're going to go ahead and share our mostly picture slides with you guys. All right, so in this workshop, we have a couple of things we want to cover. And of course, we welcome all your questions about anything nut related. The nuttier, the better. So we're going to share with you our experience, our successes, our failures, establishing a nut farm. And we're going to talk about how we established our farm, how we got everything in the ground, and how we maintain our plantings, mostly by hand. And we're also going to cover our SARE research. We received a SARE grant in 2018, a 3-year grant to study perennial ground covers. And so we want to share with you the kind of ongoing observations we've made and soon to be results from that study. And then we'll also talk a little bit about the potential for a nut growing industry in the Northeast and any other topics that you all would like us to cover or discuss at the end. So we are here, you are here, Nutwood Farm. We are actually sitting in the basement of our home that is under construction. It is the only place where we get broadband internet at the moment. So That's why we're bundled up, sitting next to a little wood stove, presenting to you. And we are in Cummington, which is in what's referred to often as the hill towns of Western Mass. So we're basically halfway in between Northampton and Pittsfield. Another way of saying that is that we are at the headwaters of the Westfield River, the East Branch in particular. All of this water that we are managing eventually trickles down and collects into the Westfield River Basin, which eventually drains into the Connecticut River. And we too have a native lands acknowledgement that I'm just going to share with you. So we are also on the traditional home and rangelands of several tribal nations, the Nipmuc and Pecumtuck, who lived in villages dotting the Connecticut River, the Algonquin name of which was in fact Connecticut, meaning long river. To our west, towards the Hudson River Valley, lived the Mohicans, or the people of the waters that are never still. And to our north are the Pennacook people of the Wabanaki Confederacy, living in the Merrimack River Valley of present-day New Hampshire and northern Massachusetts. We acknowledge that these lands were illegitimately and sometimes violently taken by English settlers, and that the original inhabitants were forced to either change their way of life in order to survive or flee. The Mohican band, who most likely lived in the hill towns, moved to the praying town of Stockbridge, Massachusetts in the 1700s and fought in several wars for the colonists, whereafter they were promised land in Western New York near Oneida and were subsequently forced to move again under the Federal Indian Removal Act in the 1830s to their current Stockbridge-Munsee Reservation in Shawano County, Wisconsin. We acknowledge that we have a long way to go in healing the trauma and transgressions that were committed here, and we are committed to learning, listening, and participating so that our children can begin a new relationship with Native descendants, this land, and themselves. As part of this healing journey, we also seek to use more appropriate language than the colonizing language often used in permaculture and regenerative agriculture, where we see humans and our history as not separate but intricately part of nature and as belonging here. So this is ongoing work that we want to dedicate ourselves to. It's not easy. Okay, take it away. This is our story.
Yeah, so back in 2014, we found 7 acres of degraded land that the former owners agreed to owner finance and sell to us, which we proceeded to open up. It had been Christmas trees between, I believe, 63 and 96, so a little over 30 years. And so the soil is highly acidified. And after the Christmas tree business closed and they decided to walk away, they called up a pulp company and invited them to clear the lot. So we've seen some satellite images of the lot following that event where the whole thing was brown and rutted and completely stripped. And that was back in like 96 or 97. And we found it in 2014, 16 or 17 years later, and it had grown up again in a diverse mixed hardwood, with 3 or 4 species of conifer and a whole mixture of hardwood and lovely mix of other species as well in the understory of blueberries and elderberry and raspberries and blackberries and winterberry and serviceberry and just tons of different things. And we found it and we're like, well, this is a site that needs regenerating. And obviously it's growing trees. And we perked it and put up a yurt. And we've been planting trees almost since.
So after the yurt, our first big purchase was this lovely old Esplund chipper, which we lovingly dubbed Nessie. She ate a lot of trees that first year. So in these pictures, you can see sort of the efforts of our clearing. We really were hacking our way in when we first began. We cut a driveway line with chainsaws and then proceeded to clear from there. So you kind of get a sense of us opening up the field. We had 30 or 40 brush piles larger than ourselves that all went through that chipper one by one. And we ended up with a pretty open field, much like it was when it was a pasture before the Christmas tree farm. But like Kalyan said, pretty degraded, pretty thin soil. And our idea, actually, you want to talk about, why we chose nuts?
Yeah, so when we first found the lot, we had both been studying permaculture and other regenerative methods, and I've done a fair bit of pruning and had basically decided that we basically decided that we wanted to grow trees. What type of trees and what crops we wanted to focus on, we hadn't decided until we found the land. And then we did a little bit of market research and found that among the trees that we could grow, nuts were essentially lacking in our local economy. There was no real production aside from a small amount of chestnuts raised for production. The Chestnut Foundation is doing a lot of work to bring it back, but there were very little commercial plantings of any nut trees besides chestnuts at all. And so we chose hazelnuts as our primary, as it seemed both hardy and resilient, and it's also a shrub, so it bears earlier. So we figured it would be a faster return while we experiment with the other potential nut crops for the area.
And I'd like to say that we drank the Kool-Aid on perennial agriculture. We really had read a lot of things. I had taken a permaculture design course before buying this land, and we really saw perennial agriculture as the way of the future, or at the very least, integrating perennial agriculture into our annual production systems. And it seemed like there wasn't enough being done yet. There was plenty of opportunity to try things and discover things. And we had enough privilege that we felt we could be experimental. And hopefully learn some things that we could teach others to speed up the revolution, as we like to say. So this diagram is from Bill Mollison's book, showing one way of planting an agroforestry system, which involves digging what he's calling hugoculture swales. So these are long trenches of swales, which is where water can collect, and then mounding soil downslope into a berm, which is then planted with perennial ground covers, vegetables, shrubs, trees, all kinds of things. And so we took this model from a book and tried to apply it with mixed results. So we'll talk about that. Keep going if you want.
Okay, so that last slide showed a lot of wood in the berms. We chose, in one of these slides, you'll see that there's a line of logs that actually delineated where we were digging, or rather where we're mounding the soil as we dug. And so we used that to lay out the berms once we had drawn the contours using whatever devices were handy, whether it was a bunyip or an A-frame.
Actually, talk about that a little bit.
A bunyip is a water level, which is a little faster than using just an A-frame, which we made one that was about 6 feet tall at first. And pendulum would swing in the wind a little bit. It was a little bit difficult to, and it was only a 5-foot step. So you had to use a lot of stakes. And, but with the bunyip, we made one that could go 20 feet in a step. So we could lay it out faster and over larger contours. Just using water, self-levels, clear tube, and a couple of small sticks. But yeah, basically the excavating we did with a rented machine. That first year we dug 11 berms, totaling about half a mile in length between them. And we planted over 400 trees that first year. And then we've been planting 200 plus every year thereafter until 2020, when we didn't plant more in the field because it was pretty much full. But we did four plantings. 15, 16, 17, and 18 and 19? No, 16, 2016, 2017, 18, and 19. Yes. And in 2020, we just expanded our orchard a little bit.
Yeah. Just to talk a little bit more about this process, like Kalyan said, we rented this mini excavator, and just to pass on some wisdom, the first year when we did the biggest installation, we rented the machine for a month. That cost us about $2,300 to do that for a month. And if you can do the upfront investment, that was the most cost effective. If you rent these machines for a week or a couple of days, it ends up costing a lot more per hour of use. So the first year we did it right, we rented it for a month, and then every year after we've tried to do it as quickly as possible in a couple of days, and it always ends up being more expensive somehow. So we also, after we laid those contour lines, you can see in the bottom left picture, you can see us burying logs. We used those logs that we just had cut down right in place to mark the contour lines that we wanted to dig, and then sort of use that as a hugelkultur mound. We discovered, though, after the fact that doing that created a lot of wonderful tunnels for voles and other rodents to make their homes in. And we suffered a lot of losses of the trees that we planted there. We think because they just took up this lovely residence in these berms that we had created for them, of course. So in subsequent years, we did not bury any logs in the mounds that we made. And I think that has made a difference. So we just passed that on as our experience, as something that didn't work so well. In terms of the planting, we got most of our planting stock, our nursery stock, from many of you may be familiar with Mark Shepard. He wrote a book called Restoration Agriculture. He has a nursery in Viola, Wisconsin called Forest Ag Enterprises, and he sells large bundles of trees, usually 25 trees in a bundle for a more affordable price than you would get trying to buy them individually. So we purchased, help me remember, 50 chestnuts, 50 English walnuts, and 250 hazelnuts for that first year planting.
We actually purchased 110 chestnuts because 60 of them were American hybrids and 50 of them were Chinese.
No, we had 25 chestnuts. Anyway, yes, a lot of trees were planted that first year. Check on let's see, what else do I want to say? So then the planting process, they were all bare root trees. They all went into berms, different spacing. We can talk about that more if you're interested. The hazelnuts, we ended up spacing very closely based on some things that we had read. They ended up being about 3 feet apart, each hazelnut in the row. And that was trying to ensure that all the hazelnuts would grow together quickly and create the living hedgerows that we were looking for, the fence, basically creating a living fence with hazelnuts. And so you can see us planting those, you can sort of make out where the whips are. So we dug all those berms, we raked them, and we covered them in wood chips, and then we planted each tree in a nice little soup of compost and amendments, lime and kelp, and biochar, and I'm trying to remember what else was in that mix that we made up. And then we basically kind of walked away and watched them leaf out slowly. And this is a picture, this is probably 3 years later, 2018. You can see, get a sense of the swales. After a rainstorm, they filled up with water. And you can see the berms with the hazelnuts growing on them. Things are pretty lush. This is probably late summer in 2018. And we also adopted some ducks to start helping us to manage our land. This is an aerial photo also in 2018 showing our yurt, the barn that we put up, actually using a crowdfunder campaign. We ran a crowdfunder to build a barn, and the barn actually has a greenhouse attached to that whole south side, which you can't see in this picture. You can also see where our construction site for the house is. And then
sitting now,
all of those green lines are the berms you can see covered in greenery, some more than others. And I think another piece of wisdom we want to pass on is we were, or at least I should speak for myself, very humbled by the vigor with which a forest that has been cut down wants to return to forest. It does not want to immediately turn into lush pasture. So we struggled for the first couple of years to be able to mow in those alleys and encourage the growth of grass, as opposed to all the stump sprouts that kept wanting to come back. So once you cut down a tree, that tree doesn't die. That tree keeps trying to grow over and over and over again. And I think, was it the second year maybe? We actually did get a brush, like a gas-powered brush cutter, to go back down the alleys to hack down again all that growth that kept coming back. So it was very much a process and a lot of labor to really try to establish meadow out of what was very recently young, vigorous forest regrowth. But now in this picture, you can see, I think this is 2019, you can see pretty wide alleys. That's, picture,
I think, we're left off.
Okay, great.
And if you don't mind, before you get started, there's a question about whether on the chestnuts.
What hazelnut variety?
What variety?
What variety? Great question. Do you want to talk about varieties?
So we've had more success with the Chinese chestnuts than anything else. We have tried several times to work with various hybrid American chestnuts, but the stock that is available is generally very small, and we until past had a nursery space to grow stock out, other than just planting in the field where we have no. So we've had a lot of losses in the field planting small stock. Anything 6 inches or smaller, it just has a hard time establishing. The stock that we've gotten from Forest Ag Enterprises, where we've gotten all of our Chinese chestnuts, is much larger. And so it's done quite well. But there's not very many suppliers that are growing out American chestnuts or at least hybrid American chestnuts that are growing them out very long. They're all selling them so small that I recommend keeping them in a nursery for a year or two before planting them in the field.
And how about hazelnuts?
All of our hazelnuts, with the exception of, I think 25, have come from Forest Ag Enterprises, and he sells 2 different seedling options. We've pretty much gotten half and half of his 2 options, and they've both done very well. Some years a bit bigger than others. It's extremely vigorous and has very healthy root systems, and we just hand dig holes and plant them with whatever amendments we have on hand that we can offer them, usually compost and alfalfa and seaweed.
But the key thing is that they're not clones. They're not varietals that are guaranteed to produce any size or quantity of nuts. So that's a big risk.
We're starting to get nuts now, but we're seeing a widespread of genetic expression in terms of size and style of husk and other things. And so we're hoping to start identifying our prime bushes and starting to make our own clones at some point soon.
Mostly just talking about trying to establish these rows and these alleys.
Yeah, so this map was done for us by a Conway student. And we had a small project done for our property 2 years ago. And this is one of the maps that she produced as part of our booklet that we got from that. And this is what was current at the time. And see where our yurt and barn is near where it says homestead. And the fruit orchard next to it, where we have a mixture of apples and pears and persimmons and peaches. And then more recently, we put a little nursery south of that barn greenhouse. And we have ambitions to move into the southwest corner, west of the driveway and closer to the road, create some more pasture and probably another greenhouse over there. Yeah. Yeah, and we have, so our ambitions with the hazelnuts is really to establish hedgerows that we can then graze in between, grazing the alleyways with most likely sheep, maybe a mixture of sheep and goats. Obviously, that's something that has to be done with care so they don't strip our trees, but it's all about timing. And ultimately, pasture management is one of the fastest way to grow topsoil that's been currently documented that I'm aware of. Yes, you can compost all you want and it's great and we need to do more of it, but grasslands has been demonstrated to grow 12 inches of soil, like a layer, but not up. It grows it down, which is just kind of, it's a different way of thinking about it, but it's building up biomass in the soil and it's just about timing the cutting. And we have ambitions to get more into mushrooms and the understory medicinals once the larger trees in the upper part of our field, the chestnuts and walnuts and butternuts and the things that we're experimenting with, once they close the canopy, we want to grow ginseng and golden seal. And we still have ambitions of putting in a small pond and rice paddy as well, because rice, paddy rice is demonstrated to be one of the most productive staple crops that I'm aware of. 8, 9 pounds per acre. I don't know anything that compares to that. And we eat a lot of rice, so we would love to do that as well. And expanding our greenhouse operation into figs and citrus and tea. But if next slide here, and just I can talk a little bit more about how we have been managing the field in terms of grass. And obviously we've been seeding a lot of clover. We have a lot of pasture in our area. We have some grass seed, but grass, if you clear other things, the grass spreads if it's already there. And because we have a lot of hay around us, the grasses are well established. The seed is there. You give them space and they grow. And mostly we've been adding the nitrogen fixers just to increase the fertility. I got into scything several years ago when living on another homestead. And I have been basically managing this field with a brush scythe. I have not been peening my blade at all, because we just have too many stumps and rocks still. Peening makes the blade too fragile to do the work that I'm doing at the moment. But I've been managing our 2-acre pasture grass while it's still green, has a tremendous amount of nitrogen in it. And if you pile it up, it doesn't all evaporate into the atmosphere and you get more into the ground.
The signal's weak, but we have you. It's just been weak. And so that's why I've asked everyone else to turn off their cameras, which sometimes will help the signal. So you're with us, but it's weak.
We're off-grid solar here, so our system is still minimal. We're waiting for the upgrade. So here's a lovely picture of our good friend Nessie, who just reminded us of the Loch Ness when she was peeking around brush piles. It's just a demonstration. These chips actually look like they're maybe mixed conifer or conifer chips, but the difference between conifer chips and ramial chips or hardwood chips, they have a lot of twigs in them. The ramial chips have all that rich cambium in there that isn't as acidifying as the conifers, and it's really the perfect food for trees. They just want the carbon, and all that cambium has so much other stuff in it too. So wood chips are kind of our gold. As we clear trees, then we use wood chips to keep the soil down and cover what we disturb. We're aiming at high disturbance initially so that we can then spend the rest of our time repairing it, but then having these earthworks to catch more water and sink it into the ground. This is a lovely little image from the AEA website, or Advancing Eco Agriculture, a company that's headed by a fellow by the name of John Kempf, who grew up a farmer in Ohio, and at some point started really studying plant health, and has made some amazing advancements. If you're not already foliar feeding whatever crop you're growing, consider foliar feeding with chelated minerals, because they directly absorb into the plants within 24 hours. And yeah, he has tons of free YouTube videos of his talks. He was the keynote speaker at NOFA 2 years ago, where I first heard him. And since then, I've had 2 seasons of foliar feeding where I can't speak highly enough of the results that we saw. Now, we have extremely degraded soils here. Like, we have 1 to 3 inches of A layer. And that has, like, we've had some really remarkable crops in our gardens, and our first nut crop last year. And yeah, it was just obvious. Like, the week following the foliar, everything just turned verdant. And I saw plants shake off pests that were otherwise overwhelming them and come back with vigor. So he has figured out some things, and I just recommend everyone to do the soil tests and study what's missing, and then study up on John Kemp and his work. And if you're not big time ag, then you can't afford his consulting services, but he has a lot of free materials and tons of YouTube videos of his talks. I can't speak highly enough for the work that he's doing. He's claiming that all of our crops currently, as they're being grown, are only acting at up to 30% of their potential. So what does it mean to release that potential? And what do they need in order to get there? And he's solved a couple of these questions in really remarkable ways that are ultimately quite affordable, because the minerals that he's giving you, that he's selling, you use minuscule amounts of them dissolved in water and sprayed on the leaves. And you can spray them every week without any possibility of overdosing if you're using his recommended doses. And it's just a way to get the minerals into the plants, because the plants then become the catalyst for building healthy soil. When a healthy plant, or when a plant is healthy, the root exudates that it's sharing with the microbiology in the soil are immense. And then the biology just does the rest. And it's really beautiful. So check out AEA and John Kemp.
And the NOFA bulk order, also a little plug there, is selling the minerals.
Or
so
some of them anyway.
If you remember, you can get them that way too.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I think, are there any questions, Paul? And just everything we've talked about so far? I'm gonna shift gears a little bit and talk about our ground cover research otherwise.
Great. Well, the signal seems to be better, at least on my end. The video and your audio has been better since we dropped you. So I'll just encourage everyone else to continue to keep our cameras off. Do you have a water source, was one of the questions?
We have an on-site well. This past year, we put an electric pump on it. We had been living before then with a hand pump, quite happily. But we have a good well, good water, high iron content, but otherwise very tasty. Yeah.
Great.
And we have a 1-year-old who's playing around us. So if we seem a little distracted, it's a loving distraction.
Our property is also pretty wet. We have a high water table. We're kind of in this interesting bit of a catchment basin on like 3 sides. Subtly, we're kind of a collecting point for both soil and water geologically, and that water remains pretty high in the landscape after rainstorms. So we've been trying to use that to our advantage and spread it out over the landscape. Oh, well, yeah, so watering the trees. Yeah, that's the purpose of the swale and berm system is, I don't think I said that. We're trying to capture that rainwater when it falls and spread it out over the field where the trees are planted as our passive irrigation system, instead of laying drip lines or pumping water into our field with electricity.
Yeah, the swale berm combination acts as both, it's both drought control and flood control, because the trees are planted on the top of the berm, so they're above high water events. And in a drought scenario, they're right next to the swale where the water collects, and it's moisture there, even if there's not standing water.
I think I see the questions now, Paul. Challenges with wildlife. Yeah, there's always going to be interactions with wildlife. Try to frame them in a positive light. Sometimes it's challenging. We have lost some trees, many trees, young trees, to rodents. We think mostly voles. They tend to like to eat the roots out from under the trees. It's really a bit baffling because there isn't really much we can do to prevent that. We can't really protect the trees underground. Anytime you try to put any like metal fencing or something around the roots, it's just going to constrict the tree in a negative way. So that's been a hard one for us to figure out. Our strategy has mostly just been to plant over and over again and plant a lot of whatever we're planting, just assuming that there are going to be losses, which is expensive if you're buying trees at $30 a pop. But the more you're able to plant your own seeds or buy things in bulk, that's the only way around that. And then, yeah, we've definitely had, I mean, we're in a pretty forested area, so there are deer. We've had bucks rub down some of our young chestnuts. That was pretty sad.
There's only one tree though.
I think there's only one. Any other? And then everyone always asks about squirrels, right? Squirrels and chipmunks for nuts. Can't really explain it, but so far they haven't really found us yet. Like there isn't a large squirrel population in our forests. That may change if they discover that there's a cache of really yummy food on our property. So I don't know what to say other than we like squirrel meat and we're gonna just try to manage that as if that becomes an issue. Let's see, lots of questions. Okay, we are growing butternuts, yes. We found a butternut tree a couple towns over that was looked beautiful and healthy and had lots of baby butternut trees growing at her feet. So we dug up those seedlings and brought them here in hopes that they would take and not be, or at least be blight resistant. We've also purchased a number of hybrid butternuts, which are either wild crosses or crosses between butternuts and Japanese heart nuts, sometimes called wart nuts. Another nut in the walnut family that has huge potential. We've heard really amazing things about their productivity. So we've got probably 20 to 30 planted out in our field right now that seem to be doing pretty well.
Probably about 10 butternuts that we've planted. We've also started finding butternuts already in our field that they've been coming up on their own. We have one larger tree that we got nuts from last year and planted a bunch. So we have some in our nursery as well from seed that fell off of our own tree. And yeah, we're very excited about the butternuts. They're very fast growing and beautiful form. And the wart nut has huge potential as being really productive. Still a sweet meat with very high oil content.
Yeah, it's another one that we just don't know a whole lot about yet.
Yeah, it's still new, so being a new hybrid.
But it's a native tree. I mean, it's been growing here forever, so of course.
And the wart nut is because it has the heart nuts resistance to the butternut blight. So the big mama tree that we found down in Hinsdale that we dug up seedlings from had a few blight sores on it, but it was also a 2.5 foot diameter trunk and a very healthy tree that had a few tennis ball sized sores on the trunk. And so my hope is that her children might find the blight resistance that she had some of, because it was certainly not killing that tree. Yeah. What are they?
AEA products you recommend?
I can't recommend an AEA product because I don't know what soil you have. That's why I say study your soil tests, and you have to bring up the bottom. So like whatever you're lacking is your most limiting factor. So you look at your soil tests and determine what's the lowest. And so you want to raise that more than anything else, but you want to raise everything. And ultimately you need balance. So you want to look at what you lack first, and you want to look at his recommended like ideal levels that you want to shoot for. And it's not an instant fix. He says, do his system for 5 years and you won't have to do it anymore, but it might still take 5 years to find that balance where the minerals are then in your soil. So it's a process, but it's an encouraging process where we could actually have optimal health.
Let's see, a couple more questions here. There's a question about using interns. We have not made any money yet with our business, so we have not been able to pay anybody to work for us. We do 95% of it ourselves, but we have organized work parties and have actually received a lot of generous labor from our friends and neighbors over the years. Sorry, everybody, if you're hearing some background noise. Okay, great. Let's see. We are not learning Sanskrit, but we would love to study Sanskrit. That would be great. PYO business strategy, to be determined. That might be part of it. We don't, our planting is quite small. It's a commercial planting, but it's still quite small compared to what could be.
I think there's other factors in pick your own business not being ideal for nuts, specifically hazelnuts, because they require both drying and a little bit of processing before they're really ready to eat. And cracking them by hand, while it can be fun if you really like cracking nuts, it takes a long time, and it takes a while for them to add up. So it might be entertaining for a snack once in a while. But if you want to process them into other things like nut butter or oil, or roast large quantities of them and cover them in chocolate or candy them, we ultimately need to mechanize. Maybe not for the picking, but for the processing. And so we're planning on hand picking. And so we'll probably be using, volunteer labor for harvesting for a little while. But this year, we had our first crop, but it only took us 3 days and like groups of 4 to 6 people for a couple hours each day to harvest our whole field. So it's not undoable at all. And when we have more nuts, we'll just put more people on, have a bigger party and have more people picking with us and feed them and send them home, and they can come buy nuts from us later.
I would say our business strategy is still leaning more towards value adding.
Absolutely.
And, we certainly want to feed our community, and we don't want to inflate the cost of the products that we're making, but that seems to be might be the only way that we can make a viable business if we're able to value add and make nut butters and oils, at least for the start of our enterprise, for the beginning. Okay, there's a couple more questions that are coming in, so we're going to keep going with questions. And
well, we do need to talk about the Sarah grant. Can we take a break from questions and finish this one more piece of the slideshow, and then we can spend maybe the rest of the time with questions.
Sounds like a plan.
Okay. If you want to entertain him for a little while.
Okay. He's sitting there.
Okay, back to the show. So Northeast SARE, Sustainable Agriculture and Research and Education, really nice people. They give farmers money to do the things that they're doing anyway. It's kind of how I say it. they're funding our research right now on perennial ground covers. This is something that isn't really well understood, certainly not on a productive commercial type scale. So we had a lot of questions going into this. First being, is it even worth it to try to establish perennial ground covers economically in a system like this? Also, what plants are good companions for hazelnuts? And do they have any positive or negative impact on the soil and the production of those nuts? So, let's see, can we go forward? There we go. Let me go back to my notes so I don't skip anything yet. Okay, so we wanted to figure out what plants were going to work well together. And I want to make a note. We're actually, one of our mentors for this project is Dave Jackie. Some of you might know him and the work that he's done. And he was very clear with us that we are not designing guilds for this project, and we should not refer to them as guilds. This is a really important piece. Guilds are defined as multiple species that are working together but filling separate ecological niches. And what we're designing here should be referred to as polycultures. So these are just plants that are performing similar functions that are all growing together. That's kind of semantics, but really important for him, and therefore something we wanted to pass on. So the characteristics that we were looking for in plants to cover the ground under the hazelnuts with were plants that would spread quickly, that were low growing, that could have a mix of tolerance to sun and shade, different wet and dry conditions. So we designed, with Dave Jackie's help, we designed 4 different trial plots. So I'm going to go through them really quickly. The first one we called our soil building plot, and you can see the species that we selected for that plot. A lot of these are also known as dynamic accumulators that draw up nutrients and make them more available in the soil. So for example, mint is known to bioaccumulate potassium and magnesium. Chives are known to build calcium, potassium, and salts. Yarrow is good for potassium, phosphorus, and copper. Comfrey is one of those mega plants. It accumulates potassium, phosphorus, calcium, copper, iron, and manganese. And my only note on comfrey is some people love it, some people hate it. We just say don't be afraid of it. It's very aggressive. It can grow many times over the season, and we just say just cut it down. It grows back, and that's the best way to manage it. The next plot that we designed, we called our nectary trial plot, which was designed to attract pollinators and increase insect predators, notably braconid wasps. And for this one, we selected a bunch of fragrant flowering species that would flower over a long season and provide pollen and nectar to our beneficial insects. For this one, you can see the list of plants that we chose. And we did have to special order some of these from a commercial nursery in flats because they weren't available to us. So the coreopsis, the plumbago, and the geranium were all things that we had to source that were a little hard to find. But we bought them in flats and transplanted plugs into the field. The third one was our nitrogen fixing plot. And we decided to do a nitrogen fixing plot because we had read about this theory that hazelnuts are nitrogen lovers and will take as much nitrogen as they can get. And some more reading revealed that this is true to an extent. The hazelnuts are really good at soaking up excess nitrogen on field edges, mainly from manure applications and fertilizers. But a grad student paper that we found actually suggested that hazelnuts don't require a lot of nitrogen in order to grow or produce nuts. So we really wanted to test that idea to see what would the effect be if we had a really heavy nitrogen focused ground cover. And for this, we used mostly clovers that would reseed, perennial clovers, the trefoil vetch, which reseeds pretty easily. And we also wanted to experiment with lupins because they're fun and pretty, and they're nitrogen fixers. And then our fourth plot was our control plot, right? So we just stuck to our original plan, which was to keep the ground covered with raymeal wood chips. This was our layout. We had 2 rows of newly planted hazelnuts that totaled 600 feet. Planted the hazelnuts 3 foot on center as we had been. The ground covers we seeded or transplanted in 30-foot blocks, and then we repeated those blocks over the span of the trial area. As I said, there were 4 different treatments, 5 repetitions for a total of 20 plots. This might not make any sense to anyone but us, but this is a diagram showing the repetition of our plots. And I'm including this mainly because this is our research and we want to share out the results of the research. If you want to dive into this anymore, we'll have reports available on the SARE website. Data collection, the things that we were collecting as sort of evidence and information for our research. We were measuring the hazelnuts at 5 inches up to see how they were growing in the soil, diameter, sorry. We measured the primary and secondary shoots at the top of the plant. We also started, on the second year, we started measuring the width of the plants as another indicator of vigor in the plants related to the vigor in the soil. We were counting the number of suckers that were put up by each plant every year. And then we also developed a rating system to assess how well the ground covers were covering the soil, because that was our main focus, was trying to keep the soil covered with living plants. The other data we were collecting, we did annual fall soil tests. We did a leaf tissue analysis. We sent some hazelnut leaves to the leaf tissue lab at UMass. We had planned to do that again this year. Unfortunately, the lab was closed due to the pandemic, so we weren't able to get results on our leaf composition. So we're actually, as a result, we're going to extend our study another year and send them leaves next summer to compare from our baseline to our last year of the study, whether there was any change in the leaf nutrient composition. We also did do some surveying of the insect population. We put out those yellow sticky cards to try to get a sense of what our insect population was and if it changed as a result of planting pollinator-friendly plants. And then we were just logging how many hours we spent maintaining those berms, weeding things that we didn't want, and just observing the interactions of the plants. And unfortunately, I don't have, I guess I don't have time, but don't have soil results to share with you yet, but that will be published eventually in our report to find out if the plants did have differing effects on our soil over time. But we can say that this list here, these 6 plants are kind of what we deem as being the most successful, most well-established. These are the plants that took off when we planted them and have continued to come back year after year. In fact, you can see in this picture that the yarrow is almost as tall as the hazelnuts and is vigorous and beautiful. This is our soil building plot. So you see the comfrey is also quite tall, and you can't see it as well, but there's mint and chives in there too that all have done really well and are kind of this gorgeous like berm of well-covered soil. You know, it's not wood chips, it's really well-established plants. Yeah, we get a lot of questions about whether we think these perennial ground covers are competing with the hazelnuts for nutrients. And I think we're really trying to shift that paradigm and not necessarily assume that 2 plants growing next to each other are competing. Well, I guess we haven't really proved that concept yet. We hope to be able to point in that direction. We might be wrong, but that's kind of the point of our study. So the SARE grant requires you to share the results of your study, which is why we wanted to include it in this presentation, to let you all know that we are doing this research and that we are excited to share the results. We have a report due this year, and we'll post our final report next year, and we might do another presentation on the results next year. But I hope that's interesting to some of you. And are there any questions about the SARE research in particular? Ground covers in general? Let's see, opening the chat window. Okay, all right. Oh, sorry.
There's a question. Do you have a plot with just wood chips, not your plant polyculture?
I'm so sorry. Can you say that one more time?
Do you have a plot with just wood chips, not your plant polyculture?
Yes. The fourth trial plot was just a ramial wood chip with no plants.
Mhm.
Also, I have a hand raised for Jose, and that may have been from last time, but just wanted to give an opportunity to answer questions or ask the question.
Yeah, that was from last time, sorry. But I guess I have a question, which is, what are the results? You find an improvement in all of those 3 test plots versus the wood chip plot?
That's our hope. We haven't analyzed our soil results to confirm if there's a significant difference, like statistically significant difference in the plots that had plants versus just wood chips. Like I said, we certainly will be excited to share that result if that's the case in our final report. But we think anecdotally, we think we've seen an improvement in both the soil and the plants. It's a little hard to say definitively. But other questions on the ground cover research? Yeah, we didn't actually try planting any vegetables or annual crops with them. So that would be really interesting to see how that would work. I don't know. Some of some of the plants that we chose are potentially commercially harvestable, like
probably more for essential oils.
Yeah, mint, oregano was one of our plants. If you wanted to try to get multiple harvests, the stacking functions thing, you could probably choose plants for that.
Geranium mycorrhizum is
it's
beautiful. That is the plant that they use for geranium oil.
Yeah, that's kind of cool.
There was a question earlier about the success of things growing underneath the butternuts and walnuts, I believe, for the juggalo. I don't know if these crops were under there as well.
Yeah, that's a good question. We planted all those juggalones. We certainly were aware that juggalone can inhibit other species from growing. We kind of planted them in a block for that reason, to try to keep them all together. I wouldn't say that we've noticed that, it's not like there's bare ground underneath all the juggalones.
Well, also there's a long list of juggalone tolerant plants in Dave Jackie's book, Edible Forest Gardens, that we refer to all the time. And Dave Jackie being one of the mentors in this project, we definitely considered his work as a primary source for information. So there's like a full page list of species in the Edible Forest Gardens that list the juggalone tolerance. And there's a lot of common plants in there that you would want to grow anyway, and a lot of other fruit trees and different things that don't mind it at all. So it's not something that has to be all by itself by any means.
There's a question, do you cut the polycultures back periodically?
Cutting back the polyculture ground covers was not part of the SARE plan that we made with them as our 3-year management and observation. So because it wasn't part of the plan, we haven't. They also, most of them have long bloom times with their flowers. So I don't want to cut them while they're blooming, because the nectar of all the species, not just from the nectary group, are valuable for the insect life. So I have intended, or at least thought about, cutting them at the end of the year. and I usually forget to. And it's growing quite dense and it's very beautiful. And I look forward to the hazelnuts growing out of them. Because at the moment, most of the really effective ground covers are almost as tall as the trees at the moment.
Yes, now we can either keep doing questions or...
Let's keep going. If you have more to present, let's make sure we get through the presentation.
At the end of our presentation, we were just going to kind of talk to you all about the future of a potential Northeast nut industry. We can talk about some of the things that are going on in the Midwest if you're interested, or more about value adding nuts, or we're kind of thinking that it would depend on what people were curious about learning.
So this picture here that you're looking at was this past September when we were harvesting, and that's our son Rohan showing off a couple of beautiful clusters. And you know, it seemed very appropriate to have him in the picture here because everything we're doing here is
for the next generation.
You know, we're not going to get to appreciate it nearly as much as he will. And hazelnuts being a new crop to our region, they have tremendous potential because they do very well on degraded soils and on slopes, i.e. hilltown plantings where other crops aren't so appropriate. Not that you can't plant them on flat valley bottom soil too. I think they would do excellent, especially as like buffers along rivers and such, where anywhere you want to control erosion.
If anyone knows Jono Niger, he's got a really cool field in Sunderland, right in the valley, growing tree crops that are doing very well, but have different challenges, I guess. Yeah. For others.
He's doing a lot of chestnuts, but several other species as well, and he's right next to the Connecticut River. Yeah, so I think tree crops need to be planted wider, and you know, looking into the future, the potential of tree crops to both build soil, and because you don't have to till for them year after year, just not tilling is going to save us a whole ton of soil because we won't have the losses. And so we just need to think about more tree crops in general, hazelnuts and chestnuts being the two that we're focusing on the most, but tree crops as a category of food stuff that we need to familiarize ourselves more so that we reach for them instead of their annual counterparts that require a lot more soil work and thus a lot more soil loss. And because of the intensive processing needs of these crops, it's ultimately gonna, an industry is gonna require someone actually stepping up and building like a regional processing facility where small-time farmers could bring their crop and have it processed, and they can take home either the raw product or the processed product, even refined further, whether it's pressing or grinding into nut butter or making into milks.
There are some examples of this starting to happen in the Midwest. We tend to think they're about 10 to 15 years ahead of us in terms of planting, maybe 20 years ahead of us in terms of planting, selecting and harvesting hazelnuts and chestnuts. But you can look up, there's the American Hazelnut Company, which is a co-op of farmers. And they contract, I think, with probably 100 or so small growers. Many of them have other operations, but are just growing a few hazelnuts kind of on the side or on the edge of their field or something. And then they can just take the raw nuts to this processing facility and just sell them without investing in expensive equipment or anything. Same thing with, there's like the Route 9 Cooperative is doing that with chestnuts. There's other examples of this happening.
The Route 9 Cooperative is in Ohio. There's also quite a bit being done in upstate New York. They're about 6 or 8 years ahead of us instead of 20.
Finger Lakes.
The Finger Lakes region around Ithaca and between here and there in upstate New York. And there's already a small alliance of nut growers who invest in an oil press that they can press hazelnuts and hickories in shell, thus bypassing a whole processing step and still getting oil. So that's really exciting. And yeah, we need to see more people dedicating land to tree crops. Huge potential. Oil crops are something we really lack in this region. And most nuts, chestnuts are not an oil crop, but all the other nuts are. Hazelnuts in particular, 60% oil, high in tocopherols, which means if you keep them raw, they have a very long shelf life. So the storability, is years. It's not a head of lettuce that'll rot in a week if you don't keep it refrigerated. Hazelnuts actually want to be cured for a few months to improve the flavor. And so the drying process and the processing doesn't have to happen immediately either. They could be dried and then stored for processing later, or processed to shelling and then stored for processing ongoing throughout the year for value adding in small batches, which is what we're planning on doing. So we're really getting excited about hazelnut butter and oil. Hazelnut oil is really like an ideal cooking oil. It's high flavor, perfect for salad dressings, but it's also high heat, so you can do your frying with it as well. It could substitute all of our other cooking oils.
I think one thing I want to make sure I mention as the realist in this business and life venture is just honesty about the amount of money and time and labor it has taken to get this far, which is to say, not very far. We're optimistic people, but it's not a get rich quick scheme. And I think one of our goals is education. So we're meeting that, both our own education and hopefully the education of other folks who want to go down this path. But we have not, other than a few duck eggs, we haven't sold, and some sunchoke tubers. We haven't sold anything from our farm. And that's a choice we've made. There are other enterprises that have integrated poultry, I think, pretty early on, running chickens under trees. That's what Jono has done with a partner. And that's one way that I think you can make money doing tree crops without waiting the full term until they start to bear. We just don't really want to grow chickens, so we just decided not to do that. And we're just playing the long game and waiting until we figure things out enough and have enough to harvest that we can start making money selling the nuts that we're growing. But like I said, it's been 5 years and counting that we've been starting to do this.
Living with a 1-year-old.
And now we're living with a 1-year-old.
Very entertaining.
Great.
Wonderful.
By Ellen.
Maybe a couple more questions.
Great.
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Have you noticed any mast year patterns with your nut crop production? Russ noticed gathering wild hazelnuts and other species nuts. He frequently observes that he's having on years and off years.
I haven't heard of hazelnuts actually, cultivated hazelnuts masting. I believe that most nuts do mast. Maybe they don't have off years, but they have high years and low years at least. Hazelnuts are, of course, wind pollinated, and they bloom very early in the season. Around here, we've noticed mostly mid-April, but some places they bloom in March. And the weather when they're blooming, if it's really rainy, the pollen won't get to the flowers. A week of rain during bloom could devastate a harvest, but we're really so early. We've only really seen one significant harvest, so we don't have a lot of data to speculate when our next mast year will be, if the hazelnuts are going to mast.
Great.
What
about, do you have any problems with nut weevils?
We have not seen any nut weevils yet, or at least not identified them. My hope is really to push the foliar feeding and raise the nutrition of these trees. From what I've seen of doing the foliar so far, and what John Kemp claims, is that healthy plants will actually not only repel pest bugs, but actually kill soft-bodied bugs in particular. and they try to eat them. And so rather than focusing on the pests and, you know, trying to identify what the pests are and how to deal with them, we're instead trying to identify the nutrients that we need to bring in and helping our trees to get them, so that their natural immunity can do the rest.
Right. Great. Jose wants to know if part of your vision is to feed yourself from the food forest.
Absolutely. Personally, you know, we're really homestead living here, and as I've always seen it, we're trying to meet our own needs first and growing abundance of several things, at least beyond our own needs, so that we have saleable or barterable commodities to get the things that we can't produce for ourselves. So we have, you know, a small diversity of a fruit orchard, and we're doing some berries and vegetable gardens and grow our own potatoes, and just trying to do more every year, and more diversity and more quantity, and until we figure out what our needs are and what it takes to meet our own needs, and then how can we produce more than we need so that we have more to share.
Great. Ellen has had her hand raised. Ellen, do you have a question you'd like to ask? Ellen Fine?
Yeah. Yeah, so the question is, like, I think that, first of all, I think your project is just really, really neat. I hope that you are really starting to see your shift this year and next, and in terms of really actually being able to make the money that you need to be able to keep sustaining it. My question is, how does one replicate something like this in a small suburban sort of area? I actually made a kind of a hugel swale this year. And, you know, wow, having a few hazelnuts along there wouldn't be so bad. So, you know, do you have any thoughts about how we can do that in the kind of suburban or smaller, you know, bit of land, you know, like a quarter of an acre, half an acre, an acre?
Well, I would first say that, are you familiar with growing corn? And whenever people grow corn, they recommend that you plant a block of at least 4 rows, because it's wind pollinated. And if you don't get enough pollen, then your ears won't fill out. So hazelnuts work the same way. And so if you only have one backyard, you know, I would suggest planting a row, or, you know, line your yard with them or something. But you might also talk to your neighbors, because if everyone in your neighborhood planted 6 bushes in their backyards, or the front yards, would be even better, because their front yards face each other. And but just having more in the neighborhood would improve everyone's nuts. You would get more of them, and just there's more pollen, thus you have more nuts. And you don't need to do swale and berm earthworks if you don't have slope. If you have a flat yard, plant trees wherever you want them. You know, make your keyhole gardens and your, you know, diverse plantings as much as you can. And but yeah, if you're going to grow hazelnuts in particular, and you don't want to going around hand pollinating everything, I would plant as many as you can, and then encourage your neighbors to do the same. Create nut corridors, perhaps.
I love it. We can be nuts. By the way, I love hazelnuts, so this is very exciting.
They're very tasty. If you're gonna grow something, you should enjoy eating it, or vice versa. Grow what you eat, and eat what you grow. That's exciting.
Good advice.
Have you tried making hazelnut milk? Not yet. When would that happen in the curing process?
I've had some really delicious hickory milk, and ever since then, I have a friend who forages hickory nuts, and it was so tasty, and I've been wanting to try the same thing. Because potentially you don't have to like meticulously sort even the husks and shells from the nuts. You can just boil them. And I think that's how traditionally they would have been prepared from the wild. From, you know, Native Americans would have just harvested small hazelnuts from the forest and probably just boiled them and drank the milk, the nut milk.
Usually probably smashed them first, but then didn't bother sorting them. Just sweep everything into a pot full of water and boil it, and the shells float to the top, and you skim them off, and the nuts sink to the bottom. You drink the milk, and then you have the pulp at the bottom to dry out and make flour. I'm really hoping to do that with oil seed cake from pressing hazelnuts in shell.
Yeah, do you want to talk about that? Like,
yeah, just the potential. It's unrealized in my own experience at this point, because we haven't yet tried to press in shell nuts, but the idea that the press will most likely crack them because it's very high pressure in order to extract the oil. And then you have the oil seed cakes left over with most of the oil removed, which you don't need in the milk, but all the proteins left behind. And then you boil that, and then you skim the shells off and dry them out for fuel or mulch, and then take the nuts left over and dry them again and make flour.
It's one thing that we didn't mention before is really thinking about nuts and growing nuts as not just growing the nut meat for eating. There's actually multiple, you can call them byproducts, or you can call them products, principal, you know, whatever you want to call it, multiple yields from hazelnuts.
Yeah, so specifically the shells, because if you're going to harvest the nuts, then you're also harvesting the shells. And in the process of sorting the nuts out, you also sort the shells out. And the shells are the hardest thing that we can grow. You know, you might be familiar with black locust trees being a very, like a super hardwood, or our native super hardwood that's rot resistant and really, really dense. It breaks nails. So hazelnut shells are actually harder. They're a denser form of carbon. And so I've thought about biochar as an option, like, because they've designed biochar furnaces that run on pellets that are auger fed, so you can have a continuous supply of heat and biochar. And so you could feed hazelnut shells directly into that as a very high density fuel, or just use them directly as mulch or bedding for animals, and mix them with the dirt, because they'll just, that carbon will stay there because it's so dense. And then of course, we are planting hedgerows and planning on coppicing them. So when our bushes reach full size, rather than allowing them to slowly die and reduce production, once they reach full size, we'll cut them to the ground when they're dormant in the winter. And they spring back from the roots the following season, and they won't bear nuts that year. But the year after they will, and they'll step right back into nearly full production. And we get all the wood from the coppicing. So we cut them right to the ground, and we get all the pole wood and the broom handles and tool handles. And because hazelnut wood is very flexible, and traditionally it was used to make bows and arrows and tool handles. And wattle fencing, or actually the term a hurdle is actually a section of fencing that was often made with hazelnut. It's a wattle panel. Were there any other questions?
Let's see. Any comments about walnuts?
We planted 25 English walnuts our first year, and I think we've lost 20 of them, but we still have 5 that have survived, and they're eking along, and they are getting bigger. So I'm hopeful that we'll end up with a few walnuts. We might not plant more because it's doubtful that they'll survive long term, because it is a taprooted tree, and we're probably going to plant more of the butternut hybrids rather than the walnuts. As tasty as they are, we might not have an ideal site for them. But if they do well, we may plant more in the future. There's so many different types of nuts, and we have some hardy pecans, and we have the butternuts and a few heart nuts, and a bunch of boart nuts, and we have some stone pines in a little nursery on the side where we're planting along the north side of the house when it's done. And yeah, ultimately, oil crops are highly storable and dense caloric storage. And we're looking at crops that are resilient to climate change and less vulnerable to weather events, and tree crops and specifically nuts all work.
Great. Well, thank you very much. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your day and hanging out down in the basement, bearing the elements, managing the family and the internet and electricity, and overcoming obstacles to share your knowledge and the experience that you've gained through starting your farm. The only thing I can say is I thought there might be a few more nut puns, but thank you so much. And I want to encourage all of our participants to please fill out an evaluation of the workshops, not just this one, but all of them. We want your feedback about what you like and what you don't. So please feel free to fill that out. And there was one request for your Instagram handle. I don't know if you want to shout that out.
Should be Nutwood Farm is the Instagram. Yeah.
Great.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for listening and taking your time to hear what we're doing.
Great questions.